you all. Hopefully everybody can hear me fine. This is, I guess, one of the benefits of having this coronavirus come through is we get forced to learn new technologies and, doing a lot of things that way. So hopefully everybody can hear. I can see that Derek is having some challenges. Hopefully everybody else can hear. Hopefully, Derek, you can get that figured out. So maybe I'll just stall just a touch here. So there are benefits of doing this technology, and we're all getting better at it, of course, through the COVID situation. And that is, I guess, a hidden blessing behind all this tragedy and hardship. But I also wanted to just do a couple of shout outs before we get started to some fun things that are occurring out there on the internet with a few people associated with King's AgriSeeds. David Huntsberger has been doing some pretty neat Facebook little short clips. And Jeff Fritz has been doing some, I guess I did 2 so far, beautiful videos on a cover crop planting green project that he's doing. So there's a lot of fun going on, a lot of creativity. So thank you all. So hopefully everybody can hear. And so bottom line, research farm. Why do we do this at King's AgriSeeds? King's AgriSeeds was started in 1993, and we have introduced numerous forage species and now cover crops to the local industry. And without having the confidence of some experience behind us, it's kind of hard to do that. And Aaron King, back in '93, he started using his farm as a way to just verify and test these concepts out. And he really saw a difference in products and just kind of took it from there. And I eventually got hired in 2002 for King's, and then I added another component of research in that I took it to the field outside of Lancaster County and did some things on more of a stripped plot type concept, big blocks, and just had some fun with that, learning, there is a big difference between locations, whether you're in New York or Lancaster County or Virginia. Things act different in these things. So, but we kind of use our farm locally here to kind of get a feel for what's even going to work in the Northeast. But then it has to be fine-tuned out further. But we've done a lot of research over the years, and this comes at a cost, but it is well worth the cost. We enjoy doing it. We had David Wilson on board for years that did some pretty cool research things. And Tracy Neff, he came on board, before David. He kind of, what Tracy brought to the group is the ability to do, I'm going to say, more university style research plots, in that they're very small plots, and we get a chance to just see a whole bunch of things in a very tight, compact area, so that you're on more of a similar soil type and you're not moving across soil types. So, that's great. When I bought the business in 2008, we lost the farm in Paradise, Ronks Paradise, and we kind of went to do research on various locations, but that's not all that convenient because you're intruding on somebody's management. And when you do research, you kind of have some impacts on the farm that may be good or bad, depending on that scenario. So 5 years ago, we were blessed to be able to buy the farm, Oakley Farm, the farm that I live on now. And I get a chance to watch these research plots on a regular basis with Tracy managing. Tracy's kind of got a nickname of Get Her Done. So he does a beautiful job with that. And most recently, we hired son-in-law, Cody Umble, to help Tracy do plots. But we have been using this farm and the research plots to bring staff over. Some staff will help harvest. We'll just do some plot tours. just to have everybody on board for what they sell. And what this gives us is the ability to have confidence in our product line. We have a kind of we don't want black eyes. We want to know what we're doing before we, introduce new products and things like that. Now, sometimes we're forced into it a little sooner than what we would like. But this confidence, this experience that we get through our local farm here allows us to expand that confidence to the dealer network from Virginia to Maine, and encourage you guys to screen it out further. And then ultimately our end users are, have that confidence in the product line too. And it also gives us ability to do beautiful information in the product information guides and things like that. So I think that's all I would have for introducing Tracy Neff, and he has done an awesome job here at the farm, and I thank him highly for all the efforts that he does. Tracy, it's yours.
Okay, thank you. So as Tim said, we screen a lot of products at the farm. That's individual products and mixtures. We do it in a format similar to universities where they're called replicated trials. They're small plot replicated trials where each variety or entry is in a trial 3 times. And that allows us then to do some statistical analysis of the data to make sure that the yields and the information that we're collecting are really because of the variety themselves and not by random chance or because of soil type and things like that. And then there's statistics that you can do to come up with those numbers, things like a coefficient of variability, least significant difference. So with replicated trials, you can do that. It also gives you a chance to have a uniform soil site to take out soil variability, which of course can cause a big effect on how a variety or a mix would perform. When we plant these plots, it's a special planter, and the plots are kind of placed in the field, and the easiest way for me to describe it is to think of a checkerboard with your individual red and black blocks. That's how it is here on the farm. The picture you see in front, I am actually standing in between 2 different triticales. This first triticale right here in the front happens to be Gainer 154. And this darker green, a little bit back here, happened to be a new product that we're looking at called Surge. So in this trial, we're looking at, these plots are about 13 feet long, and they're 7 7-inch rows wide. And then there's a gap between each plot. The special planter we use allows us to do that. And when we harvest, we come in with a Carter Forage harvester. It's a small flail harvester, and we will actually harvest each plot down the row and get a weight, and then it allows us to pull a forage sample and send out for quality analysis. The biggest disadvantage to doing that is, of course, we know different triticales or even whatever we're testing, be it orchard grasses, be it any other kind of mixture or product, maturities are different. And if we know what the maturities are, we can try and place them in the field to harvest the early ones first if we can, but sometimes it's very difficult. So when we're looking at small grains here like Triticale, we have to use a scale called the Feek scale that we use to help rate maturities. Because when we harvest Triticale, especially, we're trying to shoot and this Feek scale here, which is a universal scale to help rate maturity on small grains. We like to be in between 8 and 9. 8 is when the flag leaf is just starting to emerge. 9 is when full flag leaf is emerged. And then stage 10 is when the head is in the boot stage or just about ready to emerge. 8 and 9 on triticales and other small grains is when we get our best yield and highest quality, if we can shoot for this range. Problem is weather. Sometimes we are here and we want to harvest and we got 3 days of rain or 2 days of rain. until we can harvest, then maybe we're in stage 10. So when we look at evaluating varieties, we have to also look at what the maturity of the crop was when we harvest. So back to this trial, as I said, these are checkerboard placed throughout the field. We come in and harvest, and then we collect our data. As I said, we look at different maturities, different plant heights. This gives you an idea here. This is actually 2 plots of wheat that were included in with the Triticale trials this year. In our Triticale trials, where we looked at straight Triticale, we looked at 11 different total varieties, and of those 11, 2 of them were wheat. So we had a total of 11 different Triticale varieties that we sourced from 5 different companies, and then we added 2 wheats because wheat is often compared to Triticale. The thing about wheat, most wheat varieties are going to mature just a little bit past what Triticale does. And also, we usually see a lower yield with wheat. Triticale, most of the time, is always going to out-yield cereal rye, and it's going to out-yield wheat. It does come to harvest the Triticale just a little bit earlier. And here, this was probably about a week before harvest, and you can see the height difference between 2 different wheat varieties here and Triticale here along the side. Again, we look at the feed scale, or that maturity rating. And when we did harvest, most of the Triticales were running in that probably 8.8 to 8.9 range. The wheats were about 8.5, so they were just a little bit more immature. If we would have waited a little bit longer to harvest the trials, the wheat would probably have a little more yield, but so would the Triticale. But the Triticale then would probably have been in boot stage, or in what we call stage 10.1, where the heads are starting to come out, and the wheat would have been still maybe like in boot stage or pre-boot. So we'll look at some numbers then to show the difference in yield that we see between wheat and Triticales. And here's the feed stage we talked about. And that stage 10.1 there is when we first start to see head emergence coming out in the small grains. And this scale is used for wheat, Triticale, rye, pretty much all the cereal grains to use as a maturity scale. So the first variety that you saw there in front, and one we're looking at here, is called Gainer. Now, Gainer is a new variety that we came out with. It comes through one of our suppliers. It is earlier than 815 from a maturity standpoint. In the trial that we harvested, Gainer was in there 3 times. And so each of the 3 plots were harvested, averaged together. Yield was calculated from a sample that was taken to get moisture and also forage quality. And Gainer was our highest yielding variety this year. We averaged 5.9 tons across those 3 replicated trials, which would equate to about 16.7 tons of feed at 65% moisture. And the feed scale at harvest was about 9.3. So the flag leaf was out the whole way, and the head was probably just towards the base of that, not emerging yet, but getting close to being emerged. So it was a very good time to harvest it. The other thing about Gainer is that its height, as you can see here, we were at about 35 inches, and this was about a week before we harvested. So the actual height came out, well, it was about 34 inches. So we were just about 36 inches when we actually harvested a week after these pictures were taken. But even when the pictures were taken, we were still building biomass, but we were still able to harvest prior to head emergence. Gainer is going to run about a week earlier than 815I. And we'll talk about 815I in just a second. Surge is another product that we looked at this year. We're not currently selling Surge, but Surge is a Triticale that we are looking at because it is what we call a facultative variety. So what does facultative mean? Facultative means that you could take this product Surge and you could plant it in the fall, just like we do our other Triticales. But because it's a facultative variety, it doesn't have to have that cold period, or what we call winter vernalization, for it to go into reproductive scale in the spring. We could actually plant surge also in the spring, and it would produce a seed head and grow similar to what it does in the fall. If we did that with a product like 815 or Gainer, they are not facultative varieties. They are winter triticales. So if we planted those in the spring, they would certainly germinate and emerge. They might get 10 inches tall, but without the winter vernalization, it's not going to force them into seed production. And they won't get tall, they won't stretch out, and they'll kind of flounder at 10 to 12 inches at the most. And as we get into summer, then they'll kind of fizzle out. So another product that we do sell, which is similar to Surge, is our VNS Spring Triticale. That is a VNS variety that is similar to Surge from the standpoint that it is facultative and you can plant it spring or fall. And I did have the VNS Spring Triticale in this trial along with Surge. And we'll look, and the difference was the Spring Triticale that we're currently selling, the VNS, yielded about 5 tons of dry matter. And you can see that Surge yielded 5.7. So we have a new and better product now that has higher yield, and the quality on the Surge, when we look at TT-NDFD compared to the Byron Spring Triticale, is about 1.5 points higher in TT-NDFD. So we got a little better quality and we have higher yield. So this is an example of how we're looking at products, new things to come in and replace current products that we have. The other thing I will mention with these small plots, I don't have to have like a 50-pound bag. I need like 4 pounds of seed, and I can get 3 plots. So that allows us to work with breeding companies and look at things very early in their program, that we can get a look at it before they even have it to the point where they have strip test quantities available. And it gives us that time to maybe get 2, maybe 3 years of data on a new variety before we can release it, which again does what Tim says, builds that confidence for the variety and prevents us from getting a black eye. Also, when we did the Surge, the Feeks at harvest was about 8.9. So the flag leaf was pretty much emerged the whole way. The Spring Triticale, the VNS that we currently sell, its Feek scale was about 8.7. So this may be just a hair earlier in maturity than the current VNS Spring Triticale. Then there's 815i. We have been selling 815, and Tim, I don't remember how long we've been selling this, but it goes back to like 2007 or earlier when I started with Kings. It has been a tremendous variety for us for both yield and quality. It has a plant structure that it allows us to use it in mixtures that works well with annual ryegrass and other components like hairy vetch and crimson clover. So in some of our mixtures like Triticale Plus, Double Play, Soil Builder, the new Dart, the 815 is a variety that works really well in mixtures. Now, 815i came out last year. 815 is an old variety. It's been around for a while, but it's still yielding very well. In our trials this year, where Gainer was #1 and Surge that we just looked at was #3, 815i came in at 7th place, just around 5 tons. So just a little bit below the Surge and about a ton less of dry matter than the Gainer. Now again, remember when we looked at Gainer, the Feek scale on that was 9.3, so it was more mature. So we will expect something like Gainer to have a little more yield because it's going to be a little more mature. It had a chance to get closer to head emergence than 815 did. So this is just a little bit behind in maturity. So we would possibly expect a little bit lower yield. So you got to kind of, when you're looking at experimentals versus current products, or when you're looking at anything, even corn hybrids, you got to use that maturity scale a little bit to kind of and use that as a scale when you're trying to evaluate how they perform. 815i came out last year, And to allow us to keep selling that variety and have it as a proprietary variety that we here in the East have the ability to use, 815 was mixed with a very small percentage of Gainer to form a new product called 815I. And the I stands for indicator. Now, when we harvested this plot of 815, the feed scale was about 8.6 on the Triticale. There was a small percent of Gainer in this, but it also still had not headed yet. If we were able to pick a time when 815 had just a few heads popping out, that's probably the Gainer that you're seeing, the small amount of Gainer in there. And that's telling you, I need to take this down now, because my 815, the major portion of 815I, is going to be heading pretty soon. So that small percentage of Gainer, which heads a little earlier, is that I part, our indicator. You might ask, well, why didn't you do that when you did this trial? There's a thing called weather and harvest windows. So, of course, we were in a very wet period. Around the end of April, we harvested this plot actually on April the 28th. And we had a small window here where we could harvest and get the products as close to that 8 to 9 in the feed scale that we were looking for. And then we had a couple of days of rain after that. So that's why we harvested when we did, just like any farmer would. And we do get a lot of calls on that. It's like, well, my Triticale's this big. Should I wait? Should I harvest? You know, and you have to evaluate that. You got to look at what your harvest window is. And my recommendation usually is if there's enough forage out there that you're going to be satisfied with as a grower to spend the time, the energy, and the fuel and cost to harvest, and you have a window, it's probably better to take it and make high quality feed if that's what you're looking for. If, on the other hand, your tonnage is your main concern, maybe you're producing Triticale for dry cows and heifers, and you're not quite as worried about the high quality. You still want good quality, but you might let it go a little longer and handle it that way. So that's 815I. There were some other experimentals that we looked at, some for the first time, some that we've looked at for a second time, and we'll be continuing to evaluate these. There was a new experimental that we looked at that yielded second. It had almost the exact same yield of Gainer and had just actually had about 2 points higher TTNDFD than what the Gainer did, and was a little bit earlier. It kind of fell in between the 815I and Gainer for maturity. So we have an exciting experimental that we want to take a look at this year. So our Triticale comparisons, the ones we talked about here, we talked mainly about Gainer being an early Triticale, about a week to maybe 10 days, potentially earlier than 815. I will mention, though, that this year, with all the cool weather we had in April, the maturities on the Triticales kind of got compacted together. There wasn't as much separation as we normally see. And I think the cool weather that we had did that. And the best example of that I can tell you is we had some rye in here that we'll talk about in just a second. And I harvested some VNS cereal rye back on, that was harvested on April 13th. It was in full flag leaf, it was in boot stage. And normally when rye is that close and in that maturity scale, you can expect those heads to pop out in about a day or two. With the cold weather we had, that cereal rye, the VNS rye, held in that state of maturity for about 10 days. Amazing. And it was the cold, exceptionally cold weather. Remember, down here in Lancaster, we were getting freezing temperatures at that time. We were getting frost warnings. So it kind of compacted the maturities. But again, back to this slide, Gainer as our early maturity. And again, 815I, which is our flagship variety in Triticale, used in a lot of our mixtures. It's called 815I because there's a small percentage of Gainer in it. Then we talked about Surge being a facultative variety and potentially a replacement for our VNS spring Triticale, but could be a product that could be planted either in the fall, like we do 815 or Gainer, or in the spring, like when we plant oats. And I also have a trial that we planted back on April 8th, an oats trial. Where it's like the Triticales. We're looking at a lot of different oat varieties, experimentals, and I do have the Surge and the VNS Spring Triticale planted in that. So we'll see how that does with the spring planting. Again, here's some a little bit more of the yield data that is showing that Gainer had about 5.9 tons of dry matter, which related to about 16 tons at 65% moisture. There you can see that experimental that yielded about the same as the Gainer, but the feed scale was just a little bit earlier than Gainer. It was an 8.9 versus a 9.3. Here's our Surge. Here's two other experimental varieties there from a supplier. We have the Byrons, or what we call the VNS Spring Triticale, and then our 815i. And I didn't show all the varieties, but to give you an idea where the wheat ended up, I did two wheat varieties. I did a VNS wheat that we were using as a cover crop variety in the fall, and I also used our Malabar wheat, and their yields were 3.6 and 3.2 tons of dry matter. Or at 65% moisture, they were about 9 and 10 tons at 65% moisture. So the yield on the wheat was exceptionally lower than the Triticale. Now, it was just a little bit more immature, where the feed scales on these Triticales that you're seeing were like, between 8.9 and 9, with 815i being about 8.6. The two wheat varieties were 8.4 and 8.2. So the flag leaves were out. We didn't harvest them, I would say, on the exceptionally early side, but a little bit earlier, but still a big difference in yield between wheat and Triticale. Now, I will say one thing about wheat. It does have good quality, similar to Triticale. Wheat always has good quality. It's just usually lower yield. We also did some of our mixtures, and if you remember last year, we came out with a few new mixtures that we were bringing to the table. And the first one here is our Dart, and it's a mixture of the 815i along with some annual ryegrass and some daikon radishes. So it's kind of similar to Triticale Plus if you're familiar with that, but how it differs from Triticale Plus is that it doesn't have as much ryegrass in it as Triticale Plus does, and there are some daikon radishes in it. So when we look at Dart for a spring forage harvest, it's more of a one-cut system. There isn't going to be enough annual ryegrass in there to really give us that second cut that we can get out of Triticale Plus. And where, again, we have about 14% annual ryegrass in the Dart 815, we have 33% ryegrass in the Triticale Plus. So this is a mix that can be used as a forage. At a lower seeding rate, we could use it as a cover. As you can see, we got very good yields on the first cut. We ended up with about 5.2 tons of dry matter, and its peaks was about 8.8. So flag leaf was fully out, wasn't in the boot stage yet, and that equates to about almost 15 tons at 65% moisture. Down here in the lower left-hand corner, you can see what the Dart looked like in the fall. You can see the daikon radishes in there. Of course, most of those died out over the winter, but this year, not quite all. In each of the Dart plots, there was just 4 or 5 radishes that had hung on because of the mild winter that we had. It was an unusually mild winter. Triticale Plus, like I say, it's very similar to Dart, except it has a higher percentage of ryegrass. In the Dart, with a lower percentage of ryegrass, if we go back to Dart, this is going to have more Triticale in it. So we have a higher percent of Triticale, lower percent of annual ryegrass. With the Triticale Plus, we have a little lower percent of Triticale, but a higher percent of annual ryegrass. And with that higher percent of ryegrass being like 33%, this product is where we can come back and take good second cut because it has enough ryegrass in there to do that. And we will be doing that with these trials. all the mixtures that we did, the Triticale Plus, the Dart, and the Soil Builder that we'll talk about in a second. We took first cutting off, we refertilized with another 50 units of nitrogen. And so I'll be taking a second cut of these ryegrasses probably maybe in about another week or week and a half, depending on how they grow. So Triticale Plus, a very good mix for us. Two-cut system, yielded just a little bit lower than what the Dart did, 5.2 dry matter tons versus 4.7. And again, that's probably a reflection of the fact that the Dart has a little more Triticale in it. Now, when we come back for the second cut, which is primarily going to be ryegrass, I think what we're going to see is, since the Triticale Plus has more ryegrass, I'll yield what's left of the Dart. And our third mix, I'm going to jump down to here, is Soil Builder Plus. This is a mix that we had come out with a few years ago in the Penn State trials. It's always been one of the highest yielding products that we've had. Of course, it has a combination of Triticale and annual ryegrass and hairy vetch and crimson clover. And with the Soil Builder Plus, it is also more of a one-cut system and not a two-cut, because we have to reduce the amount of ryegrass down to 10% so that we can include some crimson clover, hairy vetch, and a few daikon radishes. And in the data when this got harvested, where the Dart did 5.2 and the Triticale Plus did 4.7, this did 4.1 tons of dry matter. Again, we're going to see what it does for a second cut, but again, I expect it to be probably, of the three mixes, Dart and Triticale Plus and Soil Builder, to have the lowest second cut yield, because it has the smallest amount of annual ryegrass in there. Now, we'll see what the crimson clover and the hairy vetch contribute to that, but they will probably be there for the second. So that was the three mixtures that we did. There was another mix that we had in. It was called Green and Low. Now, Green and Low is another new product that we came out with last year. And the Green and Low is unique that it has a new product in it called Lowboy, which is a very low growing ryegrass. And here's the Lowboy right here. And Lowboy, and all these plots were harvested at the same time. So Lowboy had a height, it was about, at harvest, 17 inches. About a week before, you can see it was about 13, 14 inches here. But in the background, here is an annual ryegrass. So you can see the height difference. And the advantage of the Lowboy is that it's going to give you a dense mat of cover. It's going to give you a good depth of root system. But if we want to plant green or even burn off and plant into using this as a cover crop, we can use a little lower seeding rate, and we have a nicer either green or killed off mat to plant through that's not going to be tall like we have back here, that's going to wrap on the planters and cause issues as we go through the field. So we've taken this Lowboy ryegrass and we actually mixed some crimson clover with it. And it's about 60% crimson clover with about 40% annual ryegrass. So again, this could be used as a potential forage maybe for grazing. I wouldn't use it much as a harvestable forage for like haylage, because again, with its low throwing structure, it only yielded about 2 tons of dry matter. But from a cover crop standpoint and having a legume grass mix in there to benefit soil structure and to produce nitrogen, this could be a very nice product that will be used as a forage. We also did, and I don't have any pictures, but we did look at annual ryegrasses and some Italians. And we didn't have any pictures here, but we looked at 8 different annual ryegrasses and Italians. And these were all fall planted. So we're going to do 2 cuts on them. We got the first cut off. And in our annual ryegrass, we again harvested on the same day that we did the Triticales. The annual ryegrasses were pretty close. They were a little bit behind some like Gainer. They were about 8.3, 8.4 on the feet scale. Most of the ryegrasses were about 28 to 26 inches tall, except for the Lowboy, again, which was only 17 inches tall. We averaged about 2.5 to 3 tons on the annual ryegrasses for one cut. Of course, the low boy did much lower than that, but that would equate to somewhere around, 8 tons at 65% moisture. So considerably less than a Triticale or a Triticale mixed with annual ryegrass, but excellent quality out of things like the annual ryegrass, with Kodiak being our highest yielding annual ryegrass. Gave us 3.4 tons of dry matter, which would equate to just under 10 tons at 60% moisture. Again, it was about 28 inches tall. And we also had in there some Italians. Now, the Italians yielded a little bit less than the annuals, about 1 to 2 tenths of a ton. To give you an example, where Kodiak was 3.4 tons of dry matter. We had Green Spirit from Barenberg and the KF Allegro, the Kingfisher variety. They were at 2.9 tons of dry matter. So very close, but still just a little bit lower. We harvested those, we refertilized them. We're going to again take a second cut, maybe in about 10 to 14 days. And what I expect to see is the Italians now, the KF Allegro and the Green Spirit, have come back faster and more vigorous than the annuals, which is what we usually see. So in a second cut, I expect to see the Italians give us more forage than the annuals. After that, we're going to terminate the trial, because just like most annuals, and since the Italians were fall planted and they did vernalize, they just want to go to seed production. So we will terminate those trials and use the first two cuts. The last product I think we're going to talk about is rye. And we have a new rye that we came out with last year. It's called ProPower. It is a hybrid rye. So what does that mean? Well, it's a hybrid just like corn hybrids. It's a cross between parents, and that if you were to plant this and save the seed and plant it again, you will not get the same thing. You will get a combination of the parents and various things. Our typical cereal rye that we plant in the fall is like wheat, is like Triticale. They're not hybrids. And you can pretty much save seed, replant, and get very close to the same thing. And you still can get a little bit of drift over time, and that's why you always go back to parent seed for seed production when you're producing things like wheat and Triticale and even rye. But this hybrid rye is unique from the standpoint that it is a hybrid. It has better vigor than what typical cereal rye does. It has a tremendous ability to tiller. And when it first came out, it was being touted that you could plant 50 pounds or around a 50-pound bag to the acre and get the same kind of yield that you would out of planting, a typical VNS or other cereal rye, like maybe a rootstock or something like that, and get more yield with a lower seeding rate. So I wanted to try that. And what we did is we planted the ProPower, and I used 3 different seeding rates. And as you can see here, I used 50 pounds to the acre, which would be like a bag to the acre. Then I did 87 pounds to the acre, and one in between, 62.5. Now the 62.5 and the 87 this year, for whatever reason, they yielded about the same. We got about 5 tons of dry matter. The ProPower at a bag to the acre, we got about 4.1 tons of dry matter. The thing I will say, when you look at the harvest date, it was the same harvest date as when we harvested the Triticales. And when we look at the feet scale, let me find it here. Yeah, when we look at the feet scale, they were similar to Triticales. So the ProPower is a late maturing rye. It's going to come in about the same time as 815. It was about 8.8 on the feet scale. So the heads were not out. The flag leaf was fully emerged, but we harvested this on 428. And there's the yields we got using 3 different seeding rates. So I also did regular rye. This is the VNS rye that we sell. It's a variety not stated, but I went in and planted 4 different rates of that. I used a bag to the acre, or about 50 pounds to the acre. I did a 62.5 pound rate, an 87 pound rate, and then 125. And again, this was ready to harvest on April 13th. So it was a much earlier rye. And as you can see, even if we, I think if I go one more here, it's all together. Yeah, there we go. So the ProPower rye was harvested on 4/28. The other ryes were harvested, the VNS rye, on April 13th. And it did prove out this year that a bag of ProPower actually yielded more from a forage standpoint than 125 pounds of VNS rye planted the same time. Now, that's the key. Because ProPower is a high tillering variety, if we plant ProPower same time we start planting Triticale, and for down here in Lancaster County, that would be around, the 26th of September when this was planted last year. That gives the ProPower a chance to tiller, and it's a very profuse tiller, and that gives us the ability then to give us the same kind of yield that we're seeing when we plant rye at maybe 125 pounds to the acre. And all these plots were planted on September 26th. A year ago, I did the same trial with these feeding rates, but I didn't get a chance to plant until October, I think it was the 17th, because it was so wet in 2018 in the fall. We were just soaking wet all the time. But I didn't get them in until like October 17th. And with that late planting, the regular rye did out yield the ProPower. So if you want to use ProPower, or you have customers that want to use ProPower, it's imperative, if they want to use the lower seeding rate, which is a bag to the acre, they got to get it in almost three weeks earlier than you would normally start planting. We want to plant at the same time when we start planting wheat or planting Triticale. That's going to give it the ability to tiller, and that's going to make it yield. If they don't get the ProPower rye at a bag per acre in, if they get it in 3 weeks later, they're probably not going to be happy. It's not going to have the ability to tiller. And if you remember, for most of our small grains, the later we plant, we increase the seeding rate to make up for that tiller. Well, with the cost of the ProPower rye, it kind of throws it out of the equation because it is a higher cost. But if we can plant early and let it tiller, it looks like it can perform as well as our regular VNS type rye with more yield. And a big advantage is a later harvest date and also a longer harvest window. I've seen the ProPower have the ability to go from full flag leaf to head emergence and be very similar to our same as we have with our Triticale windows. For our typical VNS rye, we know that it can be ready today and headed out tomorrow. That's the big advantage of the ProPower. At this time, that's about all I have to present. We're about 9:15. We wanted to wrap up around 9:30, I believe. So we covered an awful lot of stuff on just a few things. And there's so much more in the plots that we did this year too. I mean, I did some things where we looked at a new wheat, an organic wheat that is supposed to do as well under lower fertility rates. And we used some different fertility rates and we looked at those. I looked at some comparison of some VNS rye. I looked at a couple new winter mixtures that we put together. But I wanted to cover today the main things that we harvested that are in our portfolio of products that we can use to sell customers. All this data will come out in that data packet that you get every year. We might want to send this out a little sooner as we get in towards late summer to aid and help you with your sales of the winter grains and winter grain mixtures. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joy.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tracy. Does anybody have any questions for Tracy? I'm going to pull up the chat bar here. And of course, you can unmute yourself at the bottom, and feel free to ask your questions live as well. David says, looking forward to the forage quality results on these winter forage and covers.
Let me make one comment on that. Something that I've had a couple calls from some customers, and something that I actually experienced in my trials. When these trials were planted, let's look at the triticales. I put 20 units of nitrogen on in the fall. There was residual nitrogen from the year before. In this previous field last spring, we had oats, and the oats crop was, after it was harvested for plots, was reincorporated into the soil, and a cover crop was applied. So there was still a good bit of nutrients in here. I put 20 units on at planting, and then in the spring I came back and put another 60 units on the triticales. So that was at least 80 units of nitrogen total. And unfortunately, my proteins were in the 13 to 14% range. And I've had some calls from some other people that have been concerned about some of their protein in the triticale. And I think what maybe why did that happen? We had pretty big yields this year. Our small plots always are going to yield a little higher than true field conditions because we have perfect little plots. We're not planting over knolls. We're not planting in ridges. We're not planting under valleys. We have everything packed at the number of seeds per plot. We do seed counts to make sure we have the same number of seeds in Gainer as we do back here in the Surge. But we had so much growth this year, and 5.9 tons of dry matter out of triticale, that's high yields. I'm thinking with the conditions that we had so much biomass that probably I could have used a little higher nitrogen rate. And I'm also wondering if the cold temperatures we had in April with the late frost, and that may have affected and dropped proteins just a little lower than what I'm normally seeing, because usually my triticale plots, I'm in that 15 to 16% range. This year, I'm in like the 13 to 14%. I'm wondering if that's what happened. So, Joy, I believe you said you had talked to someone that had that similar experience.
Yeah, that was on the Triticale Plus, and I know they put quite a bit of nitrogen to it, and they were seeing 13% protein too. So interesting. Ken says here, important to communicate to grower. Planting date makes a huge difference. Absolutely. So
especially on that ProPower rye, that is extremely critical. Other triticales and mixtures, we can increase rates as we go a little bit later, but it's really critical for the ProPower rye, that bag per acre, if we're going to use that to get that in on time.
Yep, and Tim says, oh yeah, so I guess this is the advantage of doing small plots, but last fall was super dry, of course, through September. So we did actually irrigate these plots just so that we could get a good look at the products we're testing out. So just so everybody knows, fun fact, we did irrigate them to get them started. So if there's any other questions, feel free to pop those in the chat bar. Yeah, do you have something to say, Tracy?
Yeah, I was going to say one thing. The dates that I was giving you about when we planted and to get the ProPower Ryan, I'm talking local dates here in Lancaster. For people in New York, people Western Pennsylvania, whoever else on, you got to take those dates and adjust them for your environment.
Yep. So with that being said, I think we'll go ahead and wrap this plot tour up. As Tracy said, we will be sending out data packets very soon, so you guys can go through and look at that data a little bit more closely. I know we did kind of run through that a little bit fast here. So those will be coming up. And once again, we really appreciate you guys coming on to join. This is the first time doing a virtual type call for us, so we really appreciate the feedback. We will be sending out a survey after this call, just with I think it's like 4 or 5 questions, should only take 2 minutes. If you guys would have a chance to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. We did take pictures similar to this to the perennial plots Mr. Tracy has in. That includes all of our mixes, all of our varieties. So we're kind of considering if we should try and do a similar field day with those plots. So we would really appreciate your feedback. Let's see. So I think that wraps up the call here. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Tracy, for presenting very good information. And of course, feel free to take this training and share it with coworkers, or we may even try to send it out to customers as well. So I think Tracy had a lot of good educational points on fig stages and her maturities and what we can do with Triticale. So feel free to pass that information on. And with that being said, thanks for joining, and we look forward to actually seeing you guys in person. So take care and stay safe.